Well, good afternoon and welcome to this morning's sermon. Just wanted to kind of step in before we cut to the video for this morning. Somehow I got in my mind, we're looking at the story of Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, and somehow I got it in my mind this morning that Rachel and not Rahab is who the spies that Joshua sent. Joshua sent the spies to Rachel, and somehow that was my thought. Instead, it should be Rahab. So I wanted to set that right off the top. And without any further ado, here is this morning's sermon about Joshua and the Battle of Jericho.
Well, over the last few weeks, we have been looking at various types of stories that we find in the movies and various types of stories that we find in God's Word. We've looked at spy flicks, we've looked at romance, we've looked at suspense films, and we've looked at a couple other types of films. But today we're going to take a look at another type of film, as it were, and a story that is pretty familiar to most everybody, I would imagine. But maybe you can guess what kind of story it is by the title of a couple of these films. The Deer Hunter. That's a scene from The Deer Hunter. Or perhaps Apocalypse Now. Or maybe Tora, Tora, Tora. Or The Thin Red Line. And you might think, "Oh, I see a theme going here." These are all films about military. And as we keep going, how about The Bridge Over the River Kwai, or Saving Private Ryan, Black Hawk Down, Dunkirk, which was just recently came out, Patton, and Pearl Harbor. These are all Dunkirk, especially, and Pearl Harbor, both part of the infamous World War II. General Patton was a general during World War II. But today we could simply call our movie The Battle of Jericho, or Joshua. And it is a war movie. A few weeks back, we started this movie when we saw that Joshua and Caleb, remember Joshua and Caleb, they went to the Promised Land along with 10 other spies, and they came back and they said, and the 10 other spies says, no, we can't go to Canaan. We're going to die there because there's giants in the land, and we're like grasshoppers. And so God says, fine with you 10 guys. Boom, dead. And he says, okay, fine with you Israelites. You don't want to go to the Promised Land? Let's wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And so that's what they did. And so later on, after that little thing happens, the people again complain to Moses for water. And Moses goes, God, why did you give me these people? Why did you make me a leader among these rebellious people? Speaking of Sunday school. Why did you make me a leader among these rebellious people? And God says, don't worry about it, Moses. Just go to the rock and speak to the rock and water will flow. Well, remember what Moses did. Moses this time, instead of just speaking to the rock, he does what he did before. The first time he struck the rock and the water flowed. Well, Moses goes up. Moses is so mad he strikes the rock and water flows. But God is not happy. God said, you disobeyed me, Moses. And for that, you, along with the rest of that generation that you led out of Egypt, will not go to the Promised Land. You need to appoint a new leader. So Moses appoints his right-hand man. He appoints Joshua. And God takes Moses up to the mountain and shows him the Promised Land from the mountain. He says, this is what you could have had. Moses dies there and Joshua takes over. And after Moses dies, the Lord calls to Joshua. And we begin this story in Joshua chapter 1, verse 2. And here's what God says to Joshua. Moses, my servant, is dead. Therefore the time has come for you to lead these people, the Israelites, across the Jordan River into the land that I am giving them. I promise you what I promised to Moses. Wherever you set foot, you will be on land that I have given you. From the Negev wilderness in the south to the Lebanon mountains in the north, from the Euphrates rivers in the east to the Mediterranean Sea in the west, including all the land of the Hittites. No one will be able to stand against you as long as you live, for I will be with you as I was with Moses. I will not fail you or abandon you. Be strong and courageous. I want you to hear those words this morning again. Be strong and courageous. For you are the one who will lead these people to possess the land I swore to their ancestors I would give to them. As if God's words weren't enough once, he says it again. Be strong and very courageous. And then God says, be careful to obey all the instructions Moses gave you. Do not deviate from them, turning either to the left or to the right. And then, and only then, will you be successful in everything you do. Study this book of instruction continually. Meditate on it day and night so that you will be sure to obey everything written in it. Only then will you prosper and succeed in all you do. Do you catch a drift that God is giving to Joshua here? This is my command. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. 8 verses, 125 words. 12 of those words are these 3 words repeated 3 times. Be strong and courageous. What does that have to say to us this morning as a church? Well, immediately after God tells Joshua to do that, Joshua gathers the 3 tribes that are going to settle east of the Jordan. They are Manasseh and a couple others. And they're going to settle east of the Jordan, but God says, you know what? They have to go help you occupy the land that is to the west of the Jordan. And so they must go and fight with all of their brothers and the other tribes. And when it's all said and done, then they can come back to their assigned lands. And Joshua tells them the plan, and here's their reply. We will do whatever you command us, and we will go wherever you send us. We will obey you just as we obeyed Moses. If you were Joshua, would you be just a tad scared? Yeah. But there's something different about Joshua's generation. Listen how they finish, saying that they will never leave Joshua or forsake him, and they will follow him. In the very last verse that says, the men have finished by saying, be strong and courageous. I don't think we ever heard of that out of the Israelites before this, that they told Moses to be strong and courageous. They were constantly complaining. And so now it's Joshua's turn to send some spies. And he sends 2 spies to check out the city of Jericho, which lies on the west bank of the Jordan. And the spies end up at the house of Rachel. Now Rachel is a woman that is a resident, a citizen of Jericho. And she ends up hiding the spies from the king of Jericho so that they don't end up killed. And she hides them up on top of the roof underneath the hay. And then she even lies to the king's men. And because one of the things that Rachel said is, she goes, we in Jericho are scared to death of the Israelites. We've heard of your recent conquests, and we're scared because we know your God is with you. How's that for some faith? And Rachel hides them, and they've heard these stories, and the spies hear Rachel's appeal for help, and she goes, can you help me? I don't want you to destroy me like you're going to destroy the rest of the city. And the spies say, yes, we will save you and your family, but only if you do as we say. Only if you obey. And so the spies arrive back at their home base, and the Israelites at this point are getting ready to cross the Jordan River. And we looked at this last year, just about this time. We talked about that Joshua and the army crossed over the Jordan River at flood stage. And you remember that it was an act of obedience. It was an act of, it wasn't like Moses. When Moses stuck his rod in the water separated. But what happened at Jordan? The priest had to step into the water first before the water separated. And isn't it amazing? The moment the water stopped, God had already planned, because 20 miles upstream, God stopped the water. And when the priest stepped in the water, all of a sudden there was no water in the river. You ever think about that? What an act of obedience by the priest to step in, and millions of people cross over the Jordan River. It was an incredible act of faith, obedience, and courage. And so it's now, they cross over the Jordan River, and Joshua now commands the Israelites to consecrate themselves. For the last 40 years, while they've been wandering around in the wilderness, they have pretty much ignored God's plan. They have ignored to circumcising all the young males at 8 days of old. They have not celebrated the Passover since the very first night of Passover when they left Egypt. But here, camped out on the plains of Gilgal, the Israelites circumcised all the males, and they celebrate Passover for the very first time. And on that very first day that they celebrate Passover, do you know what happens? Manna stops flowing. Because they're finally in the promised land, and they can finally eat from the crops of the promised land. What an incredible act of faith and obedience. And so Joshua kind of looks over the situation at Jericho, and while he's standing there near Jericho, something amazing happens. Joshua 5. When Joshua was near the town of Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a sword in his hand. Joshua went up to him and demanded, "Are you friend or foe?" "Neither one," he replied. "I am the commander of the Lord's armies." Whoa. At this, Joshua fell with his face to the ground in reverence. "I am at your command," Joshua said. "What do you want your servant to do?" The commander of the Lord's army replied, "Take off your feet, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy." And Joshua did as he was told. Does this sound like a brand new beginning or what? I mean, the Israelites cross over the Jordan by faith. Now I know the order here is a little mixed up, because God came to Moses at the burning bush before they crossed over the Red Sea. But now the Lord appears as a soldier of the Lord's armies and says, "Take off your sandals, for the place you are standing is holy." Can you imagine knowing, like Joshua did, that the Lord is with you and that the Lord of heaven's armies is standing right there beside you? I bet you he was excited. And so the Bible tells us that the gates of Jericho were shut up because the people were afraid of the Israelites. And the Lord speaks to Joshua, and this is what he says. "But the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho, its king and all of its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you are to march around the town 7 times with the priests blowing the horns. When you hear the priest give one long blast on the ram's horn, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse and the people can charge straight into the town." How would you like that for a battle plan? Do you think it took a strongness of character? Do you think it took courageousness of character? Do you think it took faith to do what they were about to do? They were going to attack a city with no weapons. Wow. And so Joshua gathers the people, and he tells the people the plan, and immediately they execute the plan, and precisely as God laid it out. And it is the second act of faith, courage, and obedience that happens in the story of Joshua. Can you imagine? All right, I've got a couple musicians in here. God says, okay, Boyd, Dale, Becky, Tom, get in front of the army. You lead my people into battle with just your instruments. And we're going to put the Ark of the Covenant behind you. Oh, and by the way, the warriors, they're all behind them. How would you like that? And so the musicians, I want you to play every day. You're going to march around the city once a day for 6 days, just playing your music. Can you imagine what the people of Jericho were thinking? Who are these crazy people? And then the last day, on day number 7, they march around the city 7 times. At this point, Jericho's like, who are these people? What is their deal? The very last time, as they reach the 7th time around, the priests blow the shofar, ram's horn, and Joshua says, shout, for the Lord has given us the city. And the people shout. And the walls come tumbling down, as it says in the old song. And they rush in, and they destroy everything exactly the way that God said they should. And they rescue Rachel's family. The only thing that remains from Jericho is Rachel's family and the things that were dedicated to God, the bronze, the silver, and the gold. And those were put into the Lord's treasury. Everything else was destroyed. And you want to hear this? Listen to the way Joshua 6 ends. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his reputation spread throughout the land. Obedient people of God. What did they learn while out in the wilderness that changed these people from the people who were just complainers and constantly griping at God? Oh, do we wish we were back in Egypt? And they go and possess the land of Canaan. And I wrote in my notes, it says, did everything go right for Joshua? No. Because you remember what happened at Jericho. There was one man, Achan. He decided to take some of the bounty for himself. And so Joshua and the tribes get ready to go at Ai, and they suffer a crushing defeat. And Joshua goes to the Lord, Lord, what happened? Why did we go down in flames here? You gave us such a wonderful victory at Jericho. And he goes, there's sin in your camp. So they go and figure out what the problem was. And then after that, for the most part, again, it goes really well. And then there's that whole deception of Gibeon. But except for those 2 events, the generation of Israelites that Joshua commanded did several things. There's 4 things that I want you to remember this morning from this. The Joshua generation. And my question for you, even now, is, are you willing to be like the Joshua generation? They were strong. They were courageous. Remember, the people of Jericho, the people of Canaan were big people. They were giants. And the Israelites conquered them. They had faith. I'm going to put it one more. They acted on it. And fourthly, they were obedient even when it didn't make sense. What do you mean, God? Put the priest in the water before the water stops. What do you mean, God, putting the priest at the front of the line? What do you mean putting the warriors at the back of the line? But they were obedient, and God rewarded and unleashed their faith. So many times I hear people say, all you got to do is just have faith. But you know what? This morning I'd like to question that. Because there is so much more to living this Christian life than just having faith. Faith by itself is not enough. So, it just so happens that the primary characters in this story are mentioned in the New Testament, in the book of Hebrews, in the Great Faith Hall of Fame, found in Hebrews 11, 30 through 31. It was by faith that the people of Israel marched around Jericho for 7 days and the walls came crashing down. It was by faith that Rahab the prostitute was not destroyed with the people in her city who refused to obey God, for she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. So I want to challenge you this morning that there's more to faith than just having faith. In both of these cases, in both the Israelites and Rachel's case, it was faith acted out in obedience. Yes, the Joshua generation had faith, and we are called to have faith. But the Joshua generation acted out their faith by obeying what God had called them to do. And I really wonder sometimes if the church, and I'm not just talking about Craybrook, I'm talking about the church in general. I wonder sometimes if we're not acting out our faith the way God has called us to act out our faith. In James it says, some people were saying that they were saying to James, well, you say you have good works, but I have faith. And James says that faith, you have your actions, I have my actions, you have your faith, but faith and actions, faith without action is dead. I want you to get that. Faith without action is dead. Faith without obedience to God is dead. While attending ordination classes several years ago on the life of Jesus, my professor said, we are educated well beyond the level of our obedience. I want you to let that sink in for a second. We are educated. We come to Sunday school, we come to worship, we come to prayer meeting, and we think we are good to go. But, you know, if Sunday school is simply a time of education, if worship is simply a time of education, and we don't act upon what we have learned, and we don't act on faith in what we've learned, you might as well not show up in the first place. And so when it comes to things of faith, there's something more. And I really believe, and God has really been dealing with me in this one, that in order for faith to be unleashed, we need to be obedient to what He tells us to do. Is it sometimes going to be scary? Oh, you better believe it. You know, what's it been, 25 years now since God called us into the ministry? And we had 2 little girls. And we moved to Indiana where we didn't know anybody. I was scared to death. God has over and over said, Dale, are you willing to trust me? I've shared this before, you know, my dream Christian ministry would be traveling, getting in the bus and traveling all over and playing my guitars. I would absolutely love that. And for many years, I shared this way back when we first moved here. For many years, I thought God was calling me into full-time music ministry. And that's the way I pursued it. Even when we left Allentown, we went to Indiana. I was pursuing ministry and music. It was a church music degree. I'll never forget being in my office. We felt that our time at Flint First was coming to an end, and God said, "Are you willing to trust me?" Like, God, we already moved to Indiana, and now at that point we're sitting in Flint, Michigan, and God says, "Are you willing to trust me? Are you willing to take a step of faith?" Because up to this point I said, "You know what? I'll be a minister of music. I'll lead worship. I can do that." But God said, "Are you willing to preach to my people? Are you willing to be a pastor to my people?" That thought scared me to death. You all get to hear me preach 20 years after that. That poor first congregation, that congregation in Fort Miller, New York. Oh, bless their hearts. They had to endure some pretty poor preaching. My very first sermon I ever preached was to that congregation. I had never preached before in my entire life. Matter of fact, in speech class in high school, I went last because I was so afraid to stand up in front of people. I know that you don't believe that, but that's the way it is. What good is it to have faith if we are not obedient to God? The Israelites had faith that the promised land was where they were supposed to be. So I want you to think about this. I want you to think about the Israelites in Moses' time and the Israelites in Joshua's time. Did God's promise to the promised land change? Between the time of the spies and the time of Joshua, did God's promise change? No, it didn't. Matter of fact, from the time of the Exodus, they were told, you have to go to the promised land. What's the difference? What was the difference? What was the difference between Moses' generation and Joshua's generation? Obedience. I really want us to encourage us as a church to be obedient to what God, even when it's scary and we don't know what's going to happen. I want to encourage you. When Joshua's generation came around, they believed God had promised, and they crossed over the Jordan River. And they fought the Battle of Jericho because they had faith. But I want us to understand that it was not just faith. They were strong, courageous, but most of all, they were obedient. I really believe that God is calling us to deeper faith. Several months ago, I was talking to one of the dear saints in our church. And he said, my prayer for our church is that we would go deeper and deeper into the love of Jesus. He goes, matter of fact, that's one of my favorite songs, is deeper, deeper in the love of Jesus. And as he told me that, my heart just kind of melded with his, and I'm like, yeah, that's what I want us to see. I want us to see us go deeper and deeper into the love of Jesus and become strong, courageous in obedience, and draw us deeper into faith, and draw us deeper into obedience for what He has planned for us. That's my prayer for you this morning. Dear Lord Jesus, I thank you for this opportunity to share your word this morning. And Lord, I pray for our congregation. I pray for these dear friends of mine. That you would release in us great faith and great power, and help us to be obedient to you. Lord, be our vision. be the strength of our heart. Lord, show us what you want us to do. In the name of Jesus we pray.